Good afternoon, everyone. We hope all of you are keeping healthy and safe during these difficult times, and really appreciate you taking the time to join us today for this webinar on the adoption and penetration of high-tech equipment in Latin America. My name is Mariana Romero Roy. I am GHI's Director of Business Development and Intelligence, and I will be your moderator today. Before we delve into this fascinating topic, I do want to go over a few things with you. First of all, our legal notice, which I won't be reading, but I do encourage all of you to do so on your own time. In a nutshell, what we're stating here is that all that is discussed during this session is based on our own research and on our own viewpoint. And also, as you know, things are changing so fast nowadays that whatever is discussed today might or might not be as valid next week as it is today. I also wanted to give you a little bit of background information on the company, as some of you may or may not know who we are. Global Health Intelligence was founded in 2014. However, we have more than 20 years experience conducting market research and market intelligence across the region. This has enabled us, as you can see on screen, not only to come up with very unique services, but also have a really wide array of information that is quite unique for Latin America and the healthcare industry. Each year we come up with new services, more coverage, and great publications for existing and potential clients. Moving along to the webinar portion, we have an amazing panelist today with us, starting with Guillaume Corpart, our CEO and founder. We also have Matthew Collings from Medtronic. He is the manager for the surgical robotics in Latin America. And we also have Vanessa Teixe. She's a health economics superintendent at Hospital Albert Einstein in Brazil. In terms of the structure of today's webinar, we will begin by seeing where Latin America stands in the global context of healthcare. We will then see how technology works in Latin America, and we will present the TechTier adoption model. We will then go over the demographics of high-tech institutions. Then we will see the leading high-tech hospitals of Latin America. And at the end of the webinar, we will have a Q&A session. For that purpose, I ask all of you to please go to the lower part of your screen. You will see a Q&A icon. If you click on it, you'll be able to input all the questions that you have throughout the webinar. Once we get to the Q&A session, we will make our best to answer all of your questions. We will also be having 4 poll questions for which I'll be popping back up to guide you through. And as a matter of fact, we will now begin with our first poll question. Why are you interested in hospital tech adoption? I work in a hospital and want to learn from best practices. I work for a technology provider and want to better understand the market. I work for a medical device equipment company and want to learn about hospital segmentation. I work in a consultancy and this is useful information. Or I find this as a fascinating topic. So do we. So please go ahead and give us your feedback. We really appreciate you letting us know more or less how it's been going and what your opinion is. So we thank you for your feedback. Something I also want to let everyone know is that both this video and the presentation of the webinar will be made available to you within 24 to 48 hours. So if you're wondering, yes, we will be sharing all of the information with you once we're done with the webinar. So let's give it a few moments so everyone can answer, and I'll be letting you know what most of you think and why most of you are here today. All right, and the results are back on. So most of you work for a medical device or equipment company and want to learn about hospital segmentation. And the rest, the majority of the rest work at a technology provider and a consultancy. But at the end of the days, I can see that we have a mix of everything here. Thank you so much for participating. Now, without further ado, I will pass it to Guillaume Corpart so he can let us know where Latin America stands in the global context of healthcare.
Great, thank you, Mariana. And thank you everyone for joining us here today. These are trying and challenging times for everyone, especially in times of pandemic. So I thank everyone for taking the time and of their busy days and being here with us today. In particular, I want to thank Matthew and Vanessa, who are in the crux of all of this and taking the time to be presenters on our webinar. If we look at hospitals on a global level, we see that there's approximately 100,000 institutions worldwide. And if we segment them by type of economy, we see that approximately 1/4 of the world's hospitals are in developed markets, call that United States, Canada, Europe, Australia, Japan, and others. That leaves 3/4 of the world's hospitals in emerging markets. Clearly, China has a predominant role in this, accounting for approximately 1/4 of the world's hospitals in and of itself. But Latin America also does too, accounting for nearly 25,000 institutions across the region. And if we dress a list of the top 10 emerging markets by number of hospitals, we see that 4 of them are in Latin America, specifically Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, and Argentina. Now, Latin America is home to a vast array of hospitals and hospital infrastructure. And if we can go to the next slide, please. We see that we're talking about nearly 22,000 institutions region-wide, close to 1 million hospital beds, and 50,000 operating rooms. So we're talking about a really strong infrastructure when it comes to healthcare. But there are also major differences between the hospitals of Latin America and those of other regions. One of those key differences is the size of the hospitals that we have in our region. The average Latin American hospital has approximately 46 beds. This compares to approximately 160 beds for the average hospital in the United States or in Europe. And the difference becomes even more stark when we're comparing public and private sector hospitals, where the private sector hospitals tend to be smaller in size still. And nowhere is this more evident than in the case of Mexico, where we see that the average private hospital has a mere 13 beds compared to over 100 in the public sector. So what does this mean for technology and technology adoption? Well, first of all, we're in a market that, while it has a very strong hospital network, it's also a market where the hospitals are much more fragmented, with many smaller players acting in the market. There's also fewer hospitals with the capacity to develop as centers of expertise, whether that be through the size of the hospital or the patient throughput within the institution. And so there's a lot more hospitals tending to primary care. And thirdly, there's a lot of hospitals that don't have the same leveraging capabilities in Latin America than they otherwise would in other regions. And leveraging capabilities both in terms of the number of patients, the beds, the throughput, as well as access to financing and financing tools in order to acquire the capital equipment and the high-tech equipment that enables them to move from one level to the next. So that's the reality of the landscape that we currently all live in and work in. And now we're going to take a look at the role of technology within Latin American institutions. Before doing that, though, I'm going to pass it back to Mariana, who's going to take us to the next poll question.
Of course, thank you, Guillaume. In your current role, how do you use segmentation data to drive sales and marketing strategies? We do very little client segmentation. We have account managers that take care of all client contact and communications. We rely on local sales teams to report information to our sales and marketing functions, or we have dedicated staff that focus on segmentation and strategy using both internal and external data. Once again, let's give it a few seconds so everyone can reply. And for those of you that are just joining us, I do want to let you know that aside from the poll questions that you'll be seeing throughout the webinar, you can also input your own questions throughout the whole session. If you go to the lower part of your screen, you will see a Q&A icon in which you can send us everything you're thinking or all the questions you might have. And we will do our best to answer them all at the end of the webinar in the Q&A session. Furthermore, both the presentation and the video will be made available more or less in 24 to 48 hours after we finish with the webinar. The results are back in. And so most of you rely on local sales teams to report information to your sales and marketing functions. The second one with 32% is we have dedicated staff that focus on segmentation and strategy using both internal and external data. Thank you everyone for your feedback. We really appreciate it.
Perfect. Thank you, Mariana. Thank you for taking the lead on this. Now, when we look at operations and the performance of hospitals, and specifically hospital systems in any country, but particularly in Latin America, we see that there's really three key factors to success. The first of which, hospital systems really need to have strong institutions, whether those be hospitals, clinics, diagnostic centers, or whatever healthcare institution may be. Hospital systems need them in order to attend the needs of the population and to respond to those needs. The second thing that hospitals or healthcare systems need is a vast array of equipment. So that's very broad, and it can include things like the capital equipment within the institution, the devices, it can include technology and pharmaceutical products. Essentially, the hospital institutions need to be well equipped. And the third pillar of success in order to have a proper healthcare system operating is to have professional staff. Now, professional staff that's going to care for the patients, but also is going to operate the equipment. And so we're talking about physicians, we're talking about nurses, about technicians, but every professional that's operating on the front line and enabling the delivery of care to their patients. So with that said, Vanessa, I'd like to turn it over to you and ask you, how does all this fit into Albert Einstein Hospital? And for those of you who don't know, Albert Einstein is probably the most recognizable institution region-wide, and certainly by far one of the top hospitals in the region and even across the world. Vanessa, on to you.
Thank you, Guillaume. And first of all, thank you for the invitation to you and Global Health Intelligence. It's a pleasure to be here today. Before talking about how we do technology evaluation and incorporation at Albert Einstein, I'd like to briefly present the society, because we're composed of many institutions inside of the Society of Albert Einstein Brazil. So we have in the private healthcare system, we have private and public institutions inside of our network. We have one hospital that is the largest hospital we have, which is the private hospital with 592 beds. And we have also primary care clinics and ambulatory care units. So our idea is to provide a wide range in the scope of care for patients, ranging from primary care to ambulatory care and high complexity in hospital care as well. And we also have a network of public institutions that are managed by Albert Einstein, and these are funded by public bodies, could be federal government or state or municipalities. We have 2 hospitals with 418 beds in total, and we have also units dedicated to primary care, ambulatory care, and psychosocial care. And we also, it's something very unique that we can also count with a group of research that are dedicated to clinical trials, observational trials. We do a lot of research in our centers, and we also have a unit dedicated to teaching. We have university, post-graduation, residency, and it's a very big investment and group we have. So having that said, please next slide. How do we manage? And we have different realities in our system, but we have very specific challenges. And for that one, I'll talk more in terms of the private system in our big hospital, that is Albert Einstein Private Hospital. And how do we handle technology incorporation? So initially, and I think that's been like that for many years in many hospitals, not only for Brazil, but for Latin America as a whole. We have physicians bring ideas of new technologies, and we have our experts and the specialty groups bring ideas of technologies that will maintain us in the edge of the technology competition. And there's a lot of competition around technology among hospitals, especially the top tier hospitals. But what we have been facing in the recent years is a lot of concern from payers about increasing costs, because what they say is, well, you bring new technologies and usually they have higher costs than the previous ones. but not always we are sure that this will really improve the outcomes of patients. So we have a lot of uncertainty about clinical outcomes related to using that new technology. And there's a lot of variability in the clinical practice. So you say that this is the best technology, why not all physicians use this? And why can you explain that some use and some don't, and how do outcomes vary? So I understand the uncertainties from the side of the payers, and that leads them to questioning the technology, and they're not willing to pay for that upfront. That's why at Albert Einstein, we have been investing a lot on information so that we are able as well to evaluate those technologies and to provide payers with information that will make them more comfortable in terms of paying. So for example, if we also have a lot of uncertainty around the technology, for example, we could get more data in trials. It could be an experimental trial or an observational trial in which we will follow patients that are using or not the technology to have more information about how that really benefits patients and how costs are increased. And we're also investing in new types of reimbursement, so value-based reimbursement models that will allow us to include new technologies and to share the risk of the benefits of that technology with payers. We're measuring outcomes related to different types of treatment performed in the hospital, including post-discharge outcomes, patient-related outcomes that we're measuring to compare the practices and to evaluate the benefit that we're bringing to patients. And we are investing in standardizing what is possible to standardize by creating care pathways that we are stimulating physicians to follow, to have the best practices implemented, which also gives payers the certainty they need about having the best treatment implemented and not using more resources than what is needed. So this is how we've been handling technology incorporation into a big investment into having information, and by changing the way we charge our treatments and the way we implement care.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Vanessa. I mean, this is fascinating from any standpoint because Albert Einstein really is an innovator in that regard and can showcase and share some of the best practices in terms of implementing and adopting technology. So thank you for those insights. I'm sure we'll have a lot of comments and questions about that in the Q&A. And again, for all of those of you who are attending and want to ask us some questions, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we see a few coming in right now already. So Vanessa, as you're saying, you know, the intention of all this is really to improve outcomes, right? Like that's why we're adopting technology to begin with, is to improve outcomes, to have better care for patients. And this can come in multiple forms, whether we're increasing the quality of care, whether we're decreasing the recovery times, or whether we're changing and evolving how we're delivering care. So moving from very invasive procedures like open surgeries to laparoscopic and then on to robotic types of surgeries. But tech adoption also has all sorts of secondary benefits, as we all know, whether it be from attracting and retaining talent within the institution, having a strong positioning within the technology realm can certainly help do that, attract those physicians that are at the cutting edge, that are pushing the frontiers of care and innovation. But also to position the hospital as a tech leader in that space, as an enabler of high quality care and the best and latest technologies, as well as contributing to the overall advancement of healthcare. So with that said, Matt, I'd like to turn it over to you and ask you to tell us a little bit about what technology means within Medtronic and technology adoption within partner institutions like hospitals, Albert Einstein, amongst others.
Excellent. Thank you, Guillaume. And thank you, Mariana, for inviting me today. It's a pleasure to be here with you too. And thank you, Vanessa, for taking time out of your busy schedule in Brazil. I realize you have a lot in your hands, so I appreciate you joining us as well. As Guillaume and Vanessa mentioned, my name is Matthew Collins, and I'm the marketing manager for Medtronic's robotic surgical business in the Latin American region. And what I'd like to do is walk us through the process that we as industry leaders take for high-tech product launches to help us ensure that the proper technology adoption occurs. Because the last thing that we want to see as a technology manufacturer is the tech sold into places where it won't be used. So if we begin the story with one of our foundational principles, starting with the patient in mind, at Medtronic, we believe that medical technology should improve outcomes and lower the overall healthcare costs, something we commonly refer to as value-based healthcare. And in order to do that in the most meaningful way, which is really to solve real challenges that surgeons, OR teams and hospitals are facing every day, we like to take a collaborative approach to technology innovation. So this really speaks to the way that we actually create the technology. And therein lies kind of the first and most important key to successful technology adoption, which is all about the relationships between industry and healthcare providers. And it's not just any relationship. This is one that's built on trust over time and grounded in the common goals to deliver the best possible care to every patient when and where they need it. So if we kind of consider that part of the R&D process, right? And as we're finishing the R&D process, we get ready to launch. It's also essential to recognize that some customers may not be at the same stage in the tech adoption process, which underscores the idea that one size fits all approach doesn't always work. So now it's on us to understand where the technology can go and should go based on certain criteria like hospital readiness and our ability to serve that hospital, just as an example. So for what works in China and the US and the EU might not work in Latin America. And within Latin America, what works in Chile or Brazil may not work in Puerto Rico, for an example. But it gets back to that point of saying, if there's value to be had in a particular healthcare environment, we're doing our best job possible to meet those kinds of needs. And I'll give you an example. About 7 years ago, I was part of a launch of a little standalone advanced energy generator called the LS10 generator system, which works advanced energy devices for what we call ligature devices. And some of you may still use this today and probably remember this launch, but as an example, in some parts of the world, sales were almost zero. But in Latin America, we sold over 5,000 of these in over 2 or 3 years. And after careful analysis, we realized that LATAM was the perfect spot for this generator because the existing LATAM generator footprint allowed for this particular device to be sold cost effectively into a high number of hospitals. In other words, the industry was able to meet the tech needs of the hospitals. So once the industry has created the right tech, it's then important for us to continue our partnership with hospitals to evaluate it and consider how it helps them achieve their clinical and economic goals. So both of them are equally important. And then it's all about the execution. And if the tech meets the goals, we can then leverage our relationships with our customers and our hospitals to ensure proper training occurs so the tech actually gets utilized appropriately. And this is a critical step, as we all know, especially when we look across Latin America. And the final step for industry, in my opinion, is to do the work in the post-sale process with our colleagues like Vanessa and economic decision makers at hospitals to build the economic evidence and to show the return on the investment on the technology and demonstrate how it helps improve patient outcomes.
Terrific, thank you, Matt. And I invite everyone to, again, ask all the questions that come to mind using the Q&A panel. We're now going to move on to the next slide and discuss a little bit about this TechTier adoption model that we've been working on for the past couple of months and the impact that it has across Latin America. Because we know that not all hospitals have the same equipment or the same capacity or the same infrastructure. And equipment penetration really depends on a whole array of factors, like you were just mentioning, Matt. And these can be, access to financing, they could be the hospital's objectives, they could be the level of care of the institution, or even the interests of the specialists at hand. So all of those are factors to take into consideration. If we move on to the next slide, please. Our hypothesis in looking at the TechTier adoption model is that hospitals evolve and they're able to acquire more advanced technologies once they've integrated the equipment leading up to that technology into their institution already. And this operates much like a stage gate system where, the premise here is that that hospitals evolve like a stage gate in which they'll acquire first some degrees of equipment, and they'll evolve into migrating into more advanced technologies as they are able to integrate it and understand how to use it and connect it to their devices internally. So how did we get to developing this TechTier model? Well, the first thing that we did is we used our hospice scope database. So for those of you who aren't aware, we have a database of hospitals that covers approximately 20,000 institutions region-wide. And it has information on all sorts of hospital characteristics, like the number of beds, the type of equipment that it has, how many of each equipment are within the institution, if the institution is public or private, etc. So we use that as the fundamental pillar in order to understand the presence of equipment. And so even at a very high level, we see that on a presence level, certain groups are starting to form. For instance, X-ray machines and incubators and infusion pumps, for instance, are fairly common and are highly present within institutions, much more so than, for instance, tomography scanners or C-arms, which in turn are more prevalent or present than angiographs and gamma cameras. So we can see these groups starting to form, and it leads us to think that hospitals will adopt the easier technologies first and evolve into acquiring and integrating the more complex technologies as they move forward. The next thing we did on the next slide is looked at the question of prevalence. Now, prevalence takes into consideration how many units of each modality a hospital may have. And we did this for over 40 equipment types. Now, what's interesting here is that prevalence is really a true indication of the capacity of a hospital and its ability to respond to healthcare needs. And so using multilinear regressions and other statistic modeling analysis, we began to understand how equipment penetration evolves from a statistical standpoint within the institution. And what's really fascinating here is that we see 6 groups starting to emerge, which goes and reinforces the hypothesis and the premise that we initially had, which is that not all hospitals have the same equipment or technology, and they go on to migrating from one step to the next. So if we go on to the next slide, please, we see that these groups, both have the equipment as the equipment evolves from one to the next, but also in terms of the penetration and the number of equipment within the institutions. So we use these findings as the basis for the TechTier adoption model, which we're presenting here, where you can see that many hospitals have equipment such as ventilators, infusion pumps, cribs, etc. And then we'll move on to having X-ray machines, and then move on to having ultrasounds, and then tomography scanners and C-arms, and finally onto very sophisticated equipment like linear accelerators, PET systems, and robotic surgery systems. Now, this model not only serves as a guide for those of you who work in institutions and hospitals with us here today to see where your institution is positioned, but it also serves as a roadmap for technology adoption and integration of these technologies into your infrastructure. For those of you who work in medical device and medical equipment companies, it also helps you look at the market slightly differently and see where certain needs might appear. So on that note, Vanessa, I'd like to ask you how you perceive this information and how it can help you or other institutions make better decisions in terms of equipment integration and acquisition.
Well, I think one point that is very critical in Brazil, and I think it may be the same in Latin America as a whole, is that we don't have very good information in our system about the infrastructure available. For example, in the COVID pandemic we're living right now, it became transparent that we don't know the exact number of beds, of hospital beds we have in Brazil as a whole. So having said that, having the information about the availability of technologies in different hospitals with different sizes, it's important because first, we know that this is available or not. And for the hospital, it can give them the information about what is the next step. So if the hospital finds itself in a specific tier and the hospital wants to invest in new technologies, it's useful to know what's the expected next step, or what hospitals that are similar to them in terms of size have available that they don't have, or what they can have additionally as a further step in that pathway of technology incorporation. So I think it's really useful to have this view that you're presenting.
Absolutely. And, a great point to that is that, oftentimes an institution will want to have the latest and greatest, jump straight into having a PET system or gamma cameras. But, clearly, leapfrogging, tech tier 4 and 5, if you're tech tier, 6, for instance, will be very challenging. It'll be challenging from an integration standpoint and from a system standpoint, even from an HR standpoint of knowing how to use that equipment and how to use it effectively and efficiently. So with that, Matt, I'd like to turn it to you and ask you how this, benefits you in terms of your marketing position and understanding, how hospitals are characterized.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is not just particular for robotic surgery per se, but in my position, it's nice to be able to see exactly what's out there, kind of like what Vanessa was saying, because I guess in the words of Peter Drucker, what gets measured gets managed, right? And if we can see exactly clearly what is today in Latin America and understand what the local hospitals are capable and willing to take on from a technology standpoint, this makes our job a heck of a lot easier because we now know where to go, why we should go there, and also where we can adopt some other types of models to maybe bring up some of the hospitals that would like to go into some, I guess, more advanced technology kind of areas, but aren't really there yet, right? In speaking from a robotic surgery standpoint in particular, or even from our energy-based device standpoint, a lot of the hospitals that we think we're going to go to are probably obviously in the upper echelon of the tier structure. But I think over time, as these hospitals develop, it's going to be interesting to see, what tactics they take and how we as industry can help get them up the ladder so they will be able to serve more patients better.
Absolutely terrific. Thanks for the comments, Matt. We have a question here from Sad Ishtiak, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, who's asking about adopting the financing models, so using leasing of equipment or having used equipment being sold into the equipments in order to increase penetration rates. And so that is something that we do see happening in Latin America. We certainly see it in private hospitals more so than the public sector ones, simply because in certain countries there are restrictions on what type of equipment public sector institutions can acquire. And generally those are new equipment. That's the case of Mexico, for instance. So refurbished or secondhand equipment would likely go to second tier private institutions in that case. But certainly I'll invite Vanessa and Matthew to comment on that as well a little bit later. So we're going to now move on to the next section, which is, what are the demographics of the institutions that we're profiling and that fall into those different tech tiers. Before going into that, I'm going to pass it over to Mariana so that she can ask the third poll question.
Thank you, Guillaume. And here we go. In your opinion, what are the biggest challenges to technology adoption in Latin America? Lack of financial resources, lack of trained personnel, lack of political interest, high cost of the equipment, or lack of financing options? While you take the time to reply to this poll, I just wanted to remind you that the presentation and the PowerPoint will be sent in more or less 24 to 48 hours. And that we're taking on all the questions that you have. If you look on the lower part of your screen, you will see a Q&A icon. If you click on it, we'll be getting all the questions that you have, and we'll do our best to reply them at the end of the webinar during the Q&A session. So let's give it a few more seconds so everyone can let us know their opinion, which is really appreciated here at Global Health Intelligence. And there we go. The results are back. So most of you think that it's lack of financial resources, followed by high cost of the equipment, lack of financing options, lack of political interest, and the last one is lack of trained personnel. Once again, thank you so much for your feedback. Guillaume, back to you.
Great. Thank you, Mariana. Thank you, everyone, for participating. Before jumping into the next section, which is really understanding the characteristics of the hospitals and at the different tier levels, there's a question from the audience here from an anonymous attendant who's asking, what tier does robotic surgery fall into? In this case, Matt, I'll let you expand on that a little bit more in the Q&A session, but in my opinion, certainly robotic surgery systems would fall into a tech tier 1, so the highest level along with PET systems, for instance. Okay.
Yeah, I would agree. I would echo that, Guillaume, just before we go on, because if you think about it, it makes perfect sense, because there's a certain amount of infrastructure and I guess baseline situations that need to occur at a hospital in order to physically fit a system, robotic system, things like this. So I think I agree with you. It's probably tier 1.
Yeah, terrific. Thanks. Awesome. Awesome. So what we then did is we used this extensive database and beyond just looking at the different tech tier segmentations and creating this adoption model and roadmap that we presented just a few slides ago, we then looked at trying to understand what are the characteristics of the hospitals at the different tech tier levels. And the first thing that we notice is that there's a great correlation between the tech tier and the size of the institution. So in order to measure size, we used both a number of beds as well as the number of operating rooms. And while at the smaller sizes, so let's say under 25 beds, there's some kind of gray area where it's harder to distinguish the tiers between tier 4, 5, and 6. Certainly the operating rooms help stand out and help distinguish how the hospital, what kind of equipment and technology the hospital has installed at that level. And operating rooms, you can see a much more clear correlation between the number of ORs and the level of technology that the hospital has installed within its facilities. So clearly, access to technology increases as hospitals get bigger. And this has to do with access to financing, as we were just talking about a moment ago, with the leverageability of the institution and the patient throughput, for instance, amongst many other factors. On the next slide, please. What we looked at next was to understand the tech penetration between public and private sector hospitals. And one of that actually is a question that just came up with a Q&A panel right a few moments ago to see if technology was more prevalent in the private institutions than in the public sector institutions. And what we see across the board throughout Latin America is that high degrees of technology and high tech tiers are present both in public and in private sector institutions. However, there's a slightly more prevalent instance of tech tiers within the private sector at the higher levels, okay? But it doesn't go to discount the fact that there are both public and private institutions operating with very solid and very robust and high-tech equipment. Vanessa, for institutions like Albert Einstein that have both the private sector and the public sector within its sphere, what can you tell us about that, about technology adoption within the institution and how that may vary between the public and private sectors?
Well, I agree. I saw the result of the previous poll, and I agree that in Latin America, we have a very specific restriction on financing. When we compare ourselves to most developed countries in terms of the money available for healthcare, we see that we have much less money available, and therefore our choices are harder and our availability to invest in technologies is lower. And I think this is transparent when we look at the public system and at the private system in Brazil. And it's not only a reality for Albert Einstein, but for the system as a whole, because considering that we have, and I think we have something particular at Albert Einstein, because many technologies that are not available in the public system as a whole, we make available in our hospitals because we're a philanthropic institution, and we believe that care and the opportunities should be given equally to patients in terms of access to good care. So we have something particular here, but when we look at the system as a whole, we see that the restrictions in access to the high technologies and the newest ones, and that are usually high cost, is very lower, this access in the public system when we compare to the private system, and especially due to affordability issues, because there's not enough money in the public system to fund that. Of course, that in practice, this leads to different outcomes, and not only technology, but also the pathways for care are different in the systems as well. We have 6,000 hospitals in Brazil as a whole, and we have realities that are very different in different regions and also between public and private. But I would put objectively that the restriction in terms of access to technologies is higher in the public system because of the lack of financial resources, especially.
Absolutely, very good point. Thank you for your insights there. So if we move on to the next slide, really see that it's not surprising to see that hospitals with higher tech tiers or higher integration of technology are also the more specialized institutions on a regional level, whereas the hospitals with a lower tech penetration tend to be much more primary care driven. And if we look at technology adoption on a regional level, if we can go to the next slide, please, we see that there's really high tech institutions in all countries across the board. But we also see that Chile stands out as having some of the highest proportion of hospitals with high-tech equipment. And this is really interesting and important from a segmentation standpoint in terms of understanding where are the more sophisticated institutions or hospitals, what can they adopt, and even profiling them, because we see that there are opportunities in every country, but not necessarily every country has the same amount of hospitals that have potential. So Matt, from your standpoint in terms of managing marketing for high-tech equipment across Latin America, what does this tell you about the region, about the region's development? And when you're making your plans and strategies, how do you go about doing that?
Yeah, this is interesting. I've been with Medtronic for about 10 years now, and this actually goes to some of the work that I used to do on upstream marketing, and it touches a little bit about what Vanessa was saying, that there, in some of our points earlier, that one size doesn't always fit everybody, right? So it really forced us as an industry and an industry leader to take a look at what we were developing and understand if we were able to meet the needs of as many people as possible. We have a saying or a slogan at Medtronic, which is alleviate pain, restore health, right? But that is not just for a certain segment of people. We want to be able to help as many people as humanly possible. So it forced us to create specific products for certain segments of the market that like in this case, Chile is majority of the time able to buy, the top level, if we're saying good, better, or best kinds of products, they're able to buy some of the better types of products. But there are some places around the world, not particularly just in Latin America, that we have developed specific products for, so that we can help as many patients as possible. So it's a challenge, but it's a blessing to be able to deliver on that.
Absolutely terrific. Thanks, Matt. And Vanessa, from your standpoint, I mean, you clearly alluded to the fact that Brazil is a very vast country, a very large country with discrepancies in terms of the level of care and attention to care across the board. But looking at it from a regional perspective, what does this type of data tell you in terms of delivering care and giving access to quality care to the populations?
Well, I think in Brazil, we really, and in the region as well, we really need this broader view of the availability of centers available and access to high-tech technologies, right? Because in the end, considering the size of Brazil and the size of our population, I really think that we need specialized centers that are big centers, reference centers, and we have to improve the access to from patients to those centers. And we need a broader range of institutions that can offer intermediate level complexity of care. And that would make sense in a country like Brazil, and it's valid for the other countries as a whole. So I think that's why we have this big group of institutions that are concentrated in tiers 3 and 4 that would probably provide this intermediate level of complexity of care, right? So I think this makes sense in a big country, and we have other big countries in Latin America as well. But what I think is needed in terms of thinking the care of the population as a whole is if we have the correct infrastructure to provide the good care that the population deserves, right? Because I think that this is not very integrated in terms of planning. And in Brazil, for example, we have a challenge in terms of what is the relationship is expected between the private system and the public system, because they should complement each other, right? And they sometimes act as independent systems. So I think this is particular for Brazil. It may be valid from some other countries, but I think we have this very transparent here in Brazil, these discrepancies. But I think this shows that we need to have a more centralized planning of how we want or we need to structure our system to provide good care for the population.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you touched upon a great point, Vanessa, which is, that the larger countries may need to structure their funneling and triage of patients from one level of care to the next much more efficiently. And they have different needs than smaller countries like Chile might have, where there's only about 400 institutions. So it's very difficult to compare a country of 400 institutions to a country of 6,000 institutions, like is the case of Brazil. So very good. Thank you for that insight. We're now going to jump into the leading high-tech hospitals of Latin America, and we're going to show you a little preview of what that work looks like. But before doing so, I'm going to turn it over back to Mariana for our fourth poll question.
Thank you, Guillaume. In your opinion, at what rate will tech adoption evolve in Latin America over the next 5 years? Less than 5% per year, 5 to 10% per year, 10 to 15% per year, 15 to 20% per year, or 20% or more per year? Once again, we really appreciate all your feedback, and letting you guys know again that you have the Q&A icon in the lower part of your screen. We've been getting a lot of interesting questions, so keep them coming. And both the presentation and the video will be made available to you more or less 24 to 48 hours from today's webinar. So let's give it a few more seconds so I can get all of your feedback. I really look forward to seeing what you guys think. There's so much noise around this, especially with high-tech equipment in Latin America. And here we go. So 39% of you think that it'll be between 5 to 10% per year, followed by 10 to 15% per year, then 15 to 20% per year. And the most of you do not think it'll take 20% or more per year. So thanks again for your feedback.
So, Mariana, that's really interesting statistics. I mean, nearly 70% of folks in this audience think that there's going to be solid and sustained growth of technology in Latin America. And I certainly hope that there is, because we are seriously underpenetrated and underpresent when it comes to high-tech equipment. And this model will certainly help institutions across the board, as well as the care providers and the medical device and equipment manufacturers, to understand what are the next steps in the evolution. So hopefully that TechTier adoption model will be useful for everyone here. Now, when we talk about tech adoption, quite frankly, we're all fascinated by this topic. Every one of us that's presenting here today, and I certainly hope every one of you as well that's listening in. And we could talk about the different cases and the different uses for tech adoption at length, and hopefully we're going to be able to have that opportunity in the Q&A session. For hospitals, tech adoption really serves both as a roadmap for understanding what are the next steps within incorporating and integrating new equipment, as well as understanding the planning sessions around that and seeing where a hospital sits today. And for equipment and device manufacturers like Medtronic and others, it really helps to understand the profile of the different institutions that they're collaborating with, understanding where they are in that adoption curve, and if they're right for incorporating new technologies, because it wouldn't be useful to sell or to attribute a technology to a hospital that's simply not ready for it. So it serves those purposes, as well as sizing the opportunity, as well as driving the sales force effectiveness, so understanding where someone needs to go and why, more importantly, why certain institutions are where they are, as well as having a roadmap for expansion. So what we've laid out here today is a list of some of the most recognizable tech tier 1 institutions across Latin America, across the major countries of Latin America. Now, these aren't in any specific order, but it is important to point out that while we are running the statistical modeling and the analysis, Hospital Albert Einstein did come out as #1. So while the rest are not in order, I do want to point that out because it is a very good point of recognition. And two caveats to this as you're reading this slide. The first of which is that this slide does not include hospital groups. So for instance, Grupo Ángeles in Mexico will not appear as Grupo Ángeles, but rather as individual hospitals, because that's where the technology is, right? That's where the equipment is. It's inside the individual hospital, not at the group level. So we've set aside major groups. We're looking at exact hospitals, and you can see here Hospital Ángeles de Chihuahua being present. Also, certain hospitals might not be present within the TechTier 1, either because they're not TechTier 1 hospitals, or because they might not have participated within our HospiScope database or our HospiScope survey. So if you see that your institution's not here and you'd like to know why, feel free to give us a call, to reach out to us by email. We'd be happy to get that data and incorporate it to make sure that you're on the right TechTier that corresponds to your institution. So looking at this overview and of hospitals and institutions throughout Latin America, Matt, how do you go about doing your segmentation at Medtronic from your marketing plans? You know, how is this type of information useful? And more importantly still, what are some of the caveats and some of the pitfalls that you'd tell folks to watch out for?
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, it's been super helpful to help me start the identification process of what the opportunity looks like, right? And for various different kinds of products that we're selling into Latin America. So now I'm able to look at this and say, okay, of these 15,000 hospitals that are in Latin America, which ones are the appropriate hospitals to target our marketing efforts and sales efforts when it comes to certain products like robotic surgery and so on and so forth.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you. Thank you. And Vanessa, from your point of view, as you know, clearly Albert Einstein appears as #1 on this list, but you also see some other very important hospitals across Brazil, but also across Latin America. What does this tell you about, you know, the different realms that you're playing with and some of your peer institutions here?
Well, I think it's useful when you can, well, there's a lot of information, as I said before, that we don't have officially in Brazil. We know by talking to other hospitals and to payers and to other institutions, how hospitals compare in terms of access to technology. We know better our competitors, for example, but I think it's useful for institutions to understand in a broader view which other hospitals are positioned in similar situations. It's useful for the population because people don't know it a lot, the availability of care, and also for payers, for example. But I think this makes it more transparent. Although I understand that this reflects the hospitals that have provided data to your research, right? And there may be other hospitals as well in the country that would position in that ranking as well. But I think it's useful to have a view of how hospitals compare each other. And we are in a process in Brazil to have benchmarks. We don't have a lot of information for benchmarking. And usually when we look for benchmarks, we try to compare ourselves to institutions that have a similar structure and that have a similar offer in terms of complexity of care that we do. So it's another way of using those tiers to try to compare hospitals in those benchmarks.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you, Vanessa. Great point. Now, you mentioned some fascinating topics here, first of which is the lack of information and across our region. And I'd like to say that that's not unique to Brazil. I think that's something that's prevalent throughout the entire region, that there's a general lack of information, not only because it's not in the culture of Latin American healthcare systems to collect and share information, but the fact that we're also operating across multiple markets, up to 22 countries across the region, makes it very complex to be able to share and compare information from one to the next. So there's definitely an information asymmetry taking place where the folks that have the greater knowledge and greater access to information can make the better decisions moving forward. And that's certainly the case in the point of the benchmarks that you're alluding to, Vanessa. Mariana is going to talk about it in just a moment, a benchmarking tool that we've come up with that will help you certainly do that. So thank you for that. A question from Meni Farber from the audience about Hospital Sírio-Libanês. It is actually on the list. It does appear in Brazil, right near Hospital de Clínicas. So Sírio-Libanês is there. as a tier 1 institution. And some other questions regarding the lack of tier 1 institutions in Colombia, for instance, amongst other countries. Well, that really has to do with the ability for institutions to integrate and incorporate technology within the hospital infrastructure and facilities. We see very important hospitals here like Fundación Valle de Lili, which is definitely one of the most reputable institutions in Colombia appearing here, as well as several others. Again, if you see that your institution is not part of this list of TechTier list and would like to better understand where it positions, we'd be happy to discuss that with you. Abel just shared the email at which you can reach us at. So before we enter the Q&A session, we'd like to leave you all with just 5 recommendations and 5 thoughts for TechTier adoption moving forward. So if we can go to the next slide, please. The first of which is to adopt a long-term outlook. We all know that we're in the middle of a pandemic, that it's a crisis out there, that it's very challenging times, but we have to remember that the pandemic will be during a very specific period of time, and we also need to consider and keep in mind the long-term healthcare needs of our population. So things like the obesity epidemic that Latin America is living through, the aging population that will be with us for the next 40 to 50 years, as well as other possible pandemics that will come around during that time. Considering factors, Vanessa, I'm going to let you talk about this in just a moment, value-based care and patient-centricness. It's important to also stay ahead of the curve when it comes to technology, be a first mover to help set the standard of care, to really help identify your institution as one of the leading ones out there, as well as anticipate remote connectivity and portability. These are 2 major trends that we're seeing on a global level, but it certainly will impact Latin America because it's less about installing new infrastructure and more about giving more care. Fourthly, building to scale and having an adoption roadmap. That's what this TechTier adoption model is exactly for, is to have that roadmap to see what's coming next and to be able to get ready for it if that's the goal and the objective of your institution. And finally, to seek system efficiencies. And Vanessa, I'm going to pass this one right on to you because we were talking about technology, but it's not just about having the equipment or the infrastructure, but also being able to connect it with your institution's technology systems in order to really get the most out of it. So can you give us an example of Albert Einstein, how that's going on and what you're living through today?
Yes, sure. And I'd like to take the opportunity to answer to one question that arrived in relation to how we collect the data on outcomes. So I think the challenge of having information available is also related, is very much related to the way we collect data and to the processes we have in place. Because first, we sometimes don't have the systems, the information technology infrastructure available for collecting the data. But after we have the system available, sometimes the processes don't work so that we have correct data available for analysis. So at Albert Einstein, we have implemented an electronic medical record system since 2017. And there has been a long training process to train all the professionals that are involved in the care of patients on how to fill in the correct information during the process of care so that we can use that afterwards. But then we wanted to contact patients after discharge. And this is where I come to the point on how we collect data related to complications. So the epidemiology unit inside the hospital is managed under health economics, which is the unit that I manage. And we have a lot of investment in IT, in platforms for analysis of data. But we also have developed, we have a unit for accelerating startups. And with one of those startups, we have developed a system that allows us to get in contact with patients after discharge by email, by message, and now we're advancing to contact them by WhatsApp and by our app. We have an app from the hospital to make sure that we get in touch with patients after surgery, for example, to make questions related to that disease and how is their functionality after surgery, quality of life. We can track if patients have been readmitted to the hospital or to our emergency room centers. And there has been a lot of investment to having that information that system available, then to implementing a process that allows us to get the correct data, and then to analyzing the data. And every time we analyze the data, we find something that we should improve. And we have kind of a continuous improvement process. So the information is every time better, so that we can improve our care, and we're starting to make this information available to physicians and to the society as in a broader sense. But there's really this challenge, and well, from one side, in terms of outcomes, we have advanced a lot in terms of integration. On another side, when we talk about value-based reimbursement, for example, we still have a challenge in terms of having a system available that allows us to implement those new models of reimbursement. So, for example, when you implement a bundle, you have to make sure that your system allows you to say that that patient belongs to a bundle. So if a patient comes back to the hospital and gets treated that is related to the initial surgery, for example, you will treat that patient, you have to document the data, but you will not charge the payer because the patient is in a bundle. And the systems we have currently implemented in Brazil as a whole don't allow us to easily implement those value-based reimbursement models. And this is a big operational challenge we're facing now.
Vanessa, thank you for that insight, and going to show that, you know, improvement when it comes to technology, when it comes to adoption, happens on any scale and any level, not just for the small and medium-sized hospitals, but also for the most recognizable and reputable institutions across our region. Before moving on to the Q&A, and Matt, I see you have a couple of questions lined up here. Let's answer those in the Q&A. I'm going to pass it over to Mariana. Just before I do that, however, I would like to say, to clarify one point about robotic surgery systems. Matt, you're clearly the expert on this topic, but correct me if I'm wrong, there's probably less than 100 institutions across Latin America that have a robotic surgery system in place. And given that small penetration and presence of RSS across the region, robotic surgery systems were not included in the TechTier adoption model. So there's a few questions about that. That's the reason. So for those of you who are looking at Colombia and saying, well, we have 15 to 18 hospitals with robotic surgery systems that should be tier 1. Yes, certainly, undoubtedly so. But given the small representation of robotic surgery across the board, it was not included to develop the TechTier model, although we do recognize that robotics is certainly at the forefront of technology. Okay. So with that, Mariana, I'm going to pass it over to you for the to kick off the Q&A session. And Matt, I can see you itching in your seat to start getting this on.
There are some good questions that came across, so appreciate it.
Indeed, but before I go to the Q&A, I do think it's crucial that I let everyone know the services that we offer at Global Health Intelligence that to some extent have helped us to gather all the unique information that we have available today. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we have more than 20 years experience conducting market research and market intelligence across the region. And this has really enabled us to be able to come up with very, very unique services, such as the case of HospiScope. Guillaume has mentioned it throughout the webinar. This is the world's only and largest hospital demographics database focused in Latin America. And it is absolutely amazing. We have information on more than 20,000 hospitals across the region, over 18 countries. And if you're interested in learning more, then you can most definitely reach out to us. Another service that is quite unique that we launched not long ago is Surgiscope. Instead of focusing in the infrastructure, equipment, and bed count of hospitals, here we delve into the procedure volume of inside hospitals across Latin America. And again, this is a very unique service that I'm sure you won't be able to find anywhere else. Moving on, we also have another service that is called ShareScope. And this service comes to help our clients that are looking to have the market size and market share in a specific market and really understand how your company is doing and how the competition is doing, what they're importing. And as most of you may know, I would say 95% of anything related to healthcare is imported in Latin America, and that is what makes this service so accurate and so powerful in terms of the market size and market share. Last but not least, we offer through InScope basically anything that you might need. This is a wide array of opportunities for clients that may have very specific needs and may want to go to a very granular level to get information. So Again, we have this service, and it's basically based on the more than 20 years of experience that we have. So this is just in a nutshell to let you know the 4 services that we have available. We also are in the midst of launching another service that is called HospiCheck. We're very excited. Vanessa, you mentioned at a certain point that the need in Latin America to be able to compare hospitals and to do benchmarks. And this is exactly what HospiCheck will provide to our clients. You'll be able to compare your institution to others, and we'll be having this available, I would say, in about more or less 1 to 2 weeks. So moving on now, we will go ahead and start with the Q&A session. Thank you for changing that. And I will start with Vanessa. So some of the attendees were asking, what are the main challenges for implementing value-based reimbursement models linked to technology incorporation in Brazil?
Well, I can list some of the challenges. First is hospitals having information to calculate how much further in the risk line they could go. For example, if I offer a bundle that includes a surgery and all the complications related to the surgery up to 30 days or up to 90 days after surgery, I must have information upfront from at least from my hospital to understand which is the risk I'm running by offering that type of agreement, right? And also having that agreed from payers, because sometimes payers don't know that, they pay for that, but they don't attach that directly to the procedure. So we need to have this agreement between hospitals that have their information and are willing to run some risk to offer new value-based agreements, and payers that understand that benefit of having more, they have predictable costs and some level of outcomes that they want to guarantee. So they have to come into that agreement. The second point is related to having outcomes data available, because first point, we don't have benchmarks in our system, but specifically when we talk about outcomes, we almost don't have any type of data. There's an initiative between private hospitals in Brazil to create a benchmark for specific diseases. But when you don't have data to compare your outcomes to other institutions, how can you say that you're delivering better value to patients if we don't know which is the outcome? What we can offer, what hospitals can offer, is predictable costs. But if we don't measure outcomes, we don't guarantee that we have the best value for patients. And I think this is the second challenge. And the third one, I have talked about that, is implementing this and having a system that allows us to control the implementation of those agreements.
Absolutely. Thank you, Vanessa. Very interesting. And Matt, what are some best practices you've seen in training healthcare providers on how to use new products?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think this is a key piece of the partnership, again, between healthcare providers and customers to provide that kind of training. And really, if you think about it, the amount of training that we'll provide is typically commensurate with the amount of training that the product actually needs. But some of the things that we do are to kind of leverage our key salespeople and KOLs to provide some of that training and expertise, and even raise awareness on the products that are to be used. Or, we could do things in more of a professional setting. And I know I was just chatting with one of my colleagues the other day. We train over 10,000 surgeons per year in formal courses that we sponsor to provide the best education for surgeons.
Awesome, thank you. On that note, what tools should we expect a medical device company to provide to help build the economic case for new technology, Matt?
Sorry, you cut out there for a second.
Yes, sorry. What tools should we expect a medical device company to provide to help build the economic case for new technology?
Yeah, good question. So again, this goes back to the partnership once again between the hospitals and Medtronic, and it's interesting because previously it was all about the technology and what we're capable of doing with that, and the industry believed that if you create a better product, people will pay for it. And that was sort of the thought process. So like I was saying, I remember 10 years ago, we were creating products they were all about the features. They were all about the bells and whistles. And of course, certain customers appreciated that. But as we grew, we started to realize that there was a much larger healthcare story to be told, and a major theme, it's been a good theme of our presentations and discussions today, is that the economic barrier is big, and this is a key driver. And so that's changed the way that we've done R&D. And so we don't just want to focus on the bells and whistles anymore, but the entire economic story for the hospital and the healthcare system is what's really important. So when it comes to the tools, any kind of any device that you get from medical device manufacturers should be able to give you some sort of analysis and on how the economics play out for you. And so some of the things that we're doing today are creating things like cost calculators, or perhaps working with folks like Vanessa for local economic studies and things of this nature.
Terrific. Thank you, Matt. There's a couple of questions from the audience here regarding to the tech adoption during COVID-19. So just as a point of reference, we track how many ventilators there are across the region in every country. And over the past 2 years, what we've seen is the number of ventilators go down in every country except Brazil. The amount of ventilators in Brazil installed grew by around 25% in the course of 2019. It's the only country in Latin America where that happened. Unfortunately, the case for the COVID-19 pandemic is also very, very strong in Brazil. How do you see, Vanessa, the impact of a pandemic like COVID-19 on technology adoption? Is it distracting or deterring a lot of the efforts that are being implemented? And then we'll pass that on to you, Matt, as well, to see how it impacts also development and the launch of products.
Yeah, we have a lot of discussion in Brazil about technologies used or possible technologies used for treating patients with COVID-19. I don't know if many of you follow that, but there was a lot of debate about using drugs. Chloroquine, for example, was under a lot of discussion. And I think what I defend, or what I believe, is that even in the scenario of a pandemic, we still need to follow evidence-based medicine and the best practices. What this has, what I think that the pandemic has shown is that we need to be more not flexible, but we need to have better processes for allowing technologies to be tested. Because in the scenario of the pandemic, we have been very fast at understanding our data or technologies available, or approving tests to be used for drugs that are dedicated to COVID-19. And so this shows that we can be faster than we have been in the past to evaluate those technologies and even to approve them if we prove that they are good for patients. But what the debate has been around is if we should be more flexible in terms of the information we require for technologies to be included in the list of public reimbursement. And I personally believe that we still have to be strict in terms of the data we demand upfront before making the technology available.
Absolutely terrific. Matt, how about you? How does a technology company like Medtronic respond in terms of technology introduction, launches, development when we're faced with something like a pandemic like COVID-19?
It's a great question. I have an opinion on the matter. So I think in 2 years, when a vaccine comes out, everything's going to go back to typically the way it was. But in the next couple of years, or however long it takes to create a vaccine, we have to think on our feet, and we have to think a little bit differently than we used to before. Think about any kind of high-tech product launch that you do, right? There are a list of 30 things that need to happen. You need to train customers. You need to square away your logistics. Typically, people are traveling from one point to another. So we're going to have to become very agile as we come to market with these things. And I think the effect of this is that, things might get pushed out a little bit later than we would like them to be. But I think we're going to stay nimble and get through this, but we're going to have to be very creative of how we go to market and how we do all of these different aspects. So for example, maybe, tech services could be a little bit more mobile with the way that we deliver this information to our guys locally. We might have to pass more of the efforts locally than we otherwise would have liked. But I think when it's all said and done, we're going to get the job done. And I think, it could be a headache for us for a little while, but I think it's sort of a temporary thing, and hopefully we can push through this.
Terrific. Matt, do you have any final thoughts for us and for the audience as we're talking about tech adoption across Latin America? Anything that really stands out for you at Medtronic?
Yeah, I have an opinion on the matter too with regards to Latin America, and I think I was glad to see the panelists, the attendees' response to the question of how quickly are things going to grow over the next couple of years. I think that was the right response, because in Latin America, I do believe that we are still a bit underpenetrated, but going forward, working together in collaboration and participating in all these kinds of activities as much as possible to analyze, the right product, the right solution, to then going back to, creating the KPIs and understanding, did we do things correctly? This is really kind of the secret sauce in the whole matter. And I think there's a big opportunity for us in Latin America over the next 5 to 10 years as things stabilize, right? As we get more saturated. But it's going to be an exciting time for us, and just excited to be part of the journey.
Terrific. Thank you, Matt. How about you, Vanessa, from the hospital standpoint, from the caregiving standpoint, do you have any additional thoughts on, or any concluding thoughts on what technology adoption means for institutions across the region?
Well, I think that big institutions such as Albert Einstein have a role to play in terms of providing information about the benefits of new technology, because we have the possibility to have access usually earlier to new technologies. And I think there's the opportunity for collaboration between institutions and actually in the region, because I understand that in every country you have competition between hospitals, right? And sometimes hospitals cannot manage to collaborate as much as they would like to. Although we can have some level of collaboration, because if we think about outcomes, for example, and benchmarks, it's useful for everybody to see what's happening with the other institutions, with patients in the end, right? But I think there's room for collaboration between institutions. We have an alliance, for example, between some Latin American reference hospitals, for example, and one of the areas we are collaborating is exchanging information about what type of data we collect from patients, how we incorporate technologies, and we want to get to the point to exchange data on the benefits we're seeing from technology incorporation. And that could be useful, for example, for smaller hospitals that don't have the investment available for information that we have, and that are not able to incorporate all the technologies. They can choose based on that information from which technologies they would benefit more. So I think there's a lot of room for that.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Vanessa. So as we wrap up, we could literally be here all afternoon talking about technology penetration and adoption within hospitals, within Latin America. We've already gone over our time here today, but I do want to thank everyone for their attention. If we can go to the next slide, please, Abel. What we're going to see here is you have our full contact information as well as our LinkedIn profiles. Let's not let the discussion end here. Please, let's be in touch. Let's communicate. This is something that we're all very enthused about, very passionate about. So we look forward to hearing your thoughts on it and exchanging over the next couple of days and weeks. In the meantime, thank you everyone for tuning in. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Vanessa, for taking time out of your busy days. And everyone, please stay safe in these challenging times. Thank you and have a great day.